You have to remember that the Bible is written as it touches history, even as it touches science tonight, although I won't really discuss that a whole lot. But as it touches history, it deals with history correctly. There have even been, of course, lots of archaeological expeditions that have found that when the Bible mentions something historically, it's been correct. There's still some that we don't know exactly how they fall and all of that, but hopefully discoveries in the future kind of bring that out to the forefront. Xerxes or Ahasuerus is one of these that actually touch in history quite a bit, but you don't know it from the standpoint of the Bible. Because, of course, what is the Bible's whole point of view? What's the whole concern of the Bible to do? It's to reveal what? The whole account of what? Jesus Christ. And in the book of Esther, it was not necessary in the book of Esther to reveal a lot of the historical information about Xerxes or Ahasuerus. What was necessary was to reveal about this woman who had faith, and what did she do in the book of Esther? She delivered herself and she delivered her people because she had what? She had great faith in God. And so these accounts in the Old Testament do deal with, as they touch history, deal with people who have great faith and who deliver those people in the realm of the actual biblical account. But it's our time to spend just a little bit in the next handful of weeks to look at history. So with Ahasuerus, with Xerxes, a lot of, and I want to show you just a couple of similes of Xerxes, and also this was one that, of course, people drew up, and then a relief that was carved. Most of the time, when you look at this Persian period, the two big rivals that they had were Egypt and Greece. And which of those two end up being the largest ones? Greece, by a long shot. So when we come into the book of Esther, this is what they're doing. They're preparing for what? They're preparing to go to battle. So in Esther chapter 1, what's taking place in Esther chapter 1? We quickly kind of get diverted off of the main historical deal because it's a feast and there's Vashti and then there's Esther. But what were they preparing for? It was a feast, but a feast for what? It was a planning session. This was an invasion that was going to have 46 nations involved and include over 1,200 fighting vessels. That is a ton. So what they were going to do is to mount a attack into Greece, and as you can see this close up here, a lot of different places that turn up being very, very important in fighting Greece. In this particular battle, we're going to talk about multiple, or between the Persians and the Greeks, there's multiple battles, multiple attacks. An attack, because you had to go so many hundreds of miles, you only had so many different attacks that you could do. But this is the attack where the Battle of Thermopylae occurred. So does anyone remember what happened at Thermopylae? That was where you had the 300 Spartans. Okay, so the 300 Spartans. You also had Salamis, which was a water battle. By the way, Thermopylae, and these are fairly small, but Thermopylae is right there, and then Salamis is down an island right here. So Thermopylae and Salamis end up being two pretty definitive battles in this area. They lose. So the end of Xerxes and the end of his reign was relatively undistinguished. He never really, after he made this After they're planning for this battle in the beginning of Esther, they lose it because of Thermopylae and Salamis. He never really distinguishes himself in battle again. In fact, he's murdered by the captain of his bodyguard. So again, Xerxes in the Bible, if you look in Ezra chapter 4, verse 6, Ezra chapter 4, verse 6, we've got this period of time. It's almost about 60 years in between the dedication of the temple and the arrival of Ezra, and that is where Esther fits in, but more notably, it's where all of these events revolving around Persia and Xerxes also occur too. So while none of it is specifically mentioned, it all fits within that time frame and within that time idea. Okay, so the next ruler that becomes very germane to us is Artaxerxes. And why is he important? How does he kind of touch the biblical narrative? How does Artaxerxes touch the biblical narrative? He encouraged who to return? This was the time of? This was Nehemiah. So Artaxerxes, the age of Artaxerxes is one of the best documented periods in classical antiquity because of a man by the name of Herodotus. Herodotus was known as the father of history. If you read about ancient things, you'll see Herodotus literally mentioned 1,000 different times. But Artaxerxes was dealing with, of course, normal problems as far as the kingdom is concerned. The normal problems being, again, of Egypt and of the Greeks. But Artaxerxes and the Jews, at the time that Ezra is kind of getting permission from Artaxerxes, he wants to come back. And as Ezra comes back along with all of those people, just a few years later, then who comes back? Nehemiah does. And not only do we have Ezra coming back, but also Nehemiah coming back. Nehemiah, more importantly, though, for what reason? Right, to build the wall. So you've got this is a representation here of Artaxerxes trying to make an appeal to those individuals who would want to come back and who would want to be a part of and support the work back in Jerusalem. You'll remember when Ezra wanted to come back, how many people did Ezra bring back with him? Do you remember? Wasn't that many. Do you remember how many it was? The first group, Joshua, Zerubbabel, had a big group. How many? We talked about it last week. About 50,000 altogether. Then we get to Ezra, and Ezra, you even see, kind of has to scrounge around for about 1,500 people. So this representation here is Artaxerxes making an appeal, supposedly to try to get more people to come back with Ezra. When Nehemiah goes back just a few years later, he only had a few hundred people. So we're not talking about large groups outside of that first one that comes back. Ezra comes back, of course, and what does Ezra try to do? What does Ezra try to do? Being a priest, he more has the inclination to set up the law, to set up the people, to set up a more spiritual way to get the people back to the law and back to following the law. Nehemiah, of course, was just trying to get the people back and trying to establish the walls of Jerusalem. After he got the walls built, though, as we finish Nehemiah wasn't going to be someone who was only physical. Then what did Nehemiah do? Nehemiah himself dealt with a lot of what? spiritual reforms, and then, of course, physical problems that related to those spiritual reforms. I had said back when we were going through Ezra and Nehemiah that Ezra kind of dealt with the spiritual and Nehemiah dealt with the physical, but you couldn't be really hard and fast on that because there was a mixture between the two of them. So just understanding that Cyrus, then Darius, then Xerxes, then Artaxerxes. These are only 4 kings, but there are a lot of people in between these 4 kings. But these 4 kings are the major ones from the Persian Empire that relate to the biblical account. Now, there's just a couple more that I want to go through for just a handful of minutes before we leave this section, and that is how the kingdom ends. Artaxerxes the second. So Artaxerxes the second had a brother whose name was Cyrus. It's kind of like the Grayson kids about the kings of England, because how many names are there as far as the kings of England are concerned? There's only like 4 of them to choose from. And how long have there been kings of England? For about 1,000 years. And there's like 4 or 5 different names that they all pick from. So that makes it tougher for us historically. We have Artaxerxes III, and he had a brother, but his brother was also named Cyrus. And essentially what these two did were they had a civil war between the two of them, fighting for the throne itself. And one of the remarkable parts about this reign, the reason why I want to bring it up, is because they had a battle. I mean, they fought it out. The two brothers did. And it was a battle of what was referred to the Battle of Canaxa. So Canaxa is a place that was in Asia Minor. Not Asia Minor, over by the Euphrates River. So this Battle of Canaxa kind of pitted these two brothers together against one another. One brother brings a lot of the Greeks, so he gets the Greeks to kind of help him. But when the battle was over, then the Greeks had to go back. And there were about 10,000 of them. So as they go back, they were referred to literally as the name, the 10,000. And they had to fight their way back home through hostile territory. And the reason why I wanted to bring this up is because one of the individuals in the 10,000, his name was Xenophon. And next to Herodotus, Xenophon is one of the great fathers of ancient history. And Xenophon told about their trip going back. The account of the trip going back was called the Anabasis, and it became one of the great books of military science in history. So that was very, very interesting, or at least it was interesting to me, just outside of this time of Ezra, Esther, and Nehemiah. Okay, so the last king of the Persian Empire is Darius the III. He became king of Persia in 336 BC. And for a long time, like a lot of kingdoms, what takes place over time? So a kingdom takes a while to kind of ramp up, and then what does it do? It kind of plateaus, and then what happens? It starts to decline. And we've talked about Artaxerxes. Pretty much the decline of the Persian Empire is dated from the reign of Artaxerxes. And again, there were a bunch of other kings. I'm only mentioning 2 of them. But Darius had just bad timing, because the same year that Darius III became king was also the same year that a young man named who rose to the throne? Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great. So Darius III, depicted on coinage, just again, it's a pretty old coin when you think about 2,300 years or so. But one of the great ways, one of the great depictions that we've had, and I can't remember what time this is, but it would have been well after the time of Christ. But it's a mosaic. And this mosaic pictures Darius III, and it more importantly pictures Darius III in battle with, guess who? Alexander the Great. Okay? Depicts him in battle with Alexander the Great. Well, of course, Alexander the Great and Darius met at what's called the Battle of Issus. The Battle of Issus in 333 BC. Alexander was quite victorious. And because Alexander was victorious, that was the end of the Persian Empire. So several times in history you have these definitive moments. The Battle of Carchemish. You know, the Battle of Carchemish is mentioned in Old Testament history. What happened at the Battle of Carchemish? That was when the Assyrians were defeated, and of course, who came in and took their place? The Babylonians did. So now here are the Persians being defeated, and now the Grecians are going to come in and take their place. So it's one of these, again, epic world battles that changes the whole that changes the whole dynamic of world power. The Battle of Issus. Okay, so that brings the Persian Empire to an end. Now, while we talk about, at least in this period of time, we want to bring up how it intersects with the Jews. So what begins to take place among the Jews in this period of time that's going to set us up for the New Testament period of time? Well, the number one thing that I think we need to bring up is the Samaritans. Because the Samaritans actually occurred as we were trying to get into Ezra, Esther, and Nehemiah. The Samaritans were already there. So how did the Samaritans come about? Through the Assyrians taking the northern tribe away. And when they took the northern tribe away, they let people come in. Mainly these were people from Assyria and Babylon, you know, that part of the world. They came in, they intermarry, and they make up the Samaritans. When we get into the New Testament, when we get into the Gospels, you know, how's the relationship between the Jews and the Samaritans? It's not good. It's not good. So just some of the depictions of the Samaritans, as we're going to look at depictions of the Samaritans versus things like the scribes and the Pharisees later on. There's not an immediate change that you can tell between the two of them. But 2 Kings chapter 17 talks about the establishment of the Samaritans. Now, do the Samaritans still exist? At one point in time, it was a large community. In fact, I mean, well back in history, considered to be at least 1 million or so. But over time, what law do they follow? What law do the Samaritans follow? Very, very strict in it. They follow the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. And what did Deuteronomy 7 say for the people who are going to follow the law of God? You will not do what? You will not marry outside of your own people. So the Samaritans have not done that. And over time, what has taken place is that the Samaritans have dwindled more and more and more. Here's a Samaritan priest who's posing by scrolls, and these scrolls would have been of one of these first 5 books of Moses. Now, I looked it up in 2017. In 2017, there was a population of 796. 796, not 796,000. 796 Samaritans, less than 1,000. So they do still exist, but they're very, very, very few in number. Another picture that shows the depiction of the Samaritans. This is a common pictured now out in religious ceremony with religious garb on. Why were the Samaritans important? I mean, why was it important to look up or to know more about the Samaritans? Because at least in one point with one of the parables that Jesus is going to make, he makes a very, very, very strong point of who your neighbor is. And your neighbor is effectively who? It's everyone, including the people that you would think would be your worst enemies. So the Samaritans come, I guess maybe if it's not the Good Samaritan, it would be hard to decide. People would have their own opinions. If it's not the Good Samaritan, then maybe the greatest kind of intersection between the Jews and the Samaritans in the New Testament would be who? The woman at the well. And even John makes the note in John chapter 4, I believe it's verse 9, that the Jews had no what with the Samaritans. Had no dealings with the Samaritans. When Jesus was resolute, had his face resolutely set to come to Jerusalem, he didn't want to come through he didn't travel through Samaria, Luke chapter 9. So it's interesting how you look at and how you see the relationship between these two people, and it's being born right now in this period of history. But we need to go on and consider also a group of people that you'd probably never heard of, and that's the Jews at Elephantine. And Elephantine was a small island in the Nile River. So we're talking about Jews now in the time of, in the intertestamental time, but Jews in Egypt. Now probably the Elephantine community comes around the time of Manasseh's reign. So before the children of Israel go into captivity, or just right as they go into captivity. And so this community comes into existence. And probably what was so important, and you can see kind of the remnants of the settlement that's there now. These wouldn't be buildings that would be back in the intertestamental time. But one of the most important things from Elephantine was the papyrus. So what is papyrus? It's a writing medium. In fact, where was papyrus born, basically? In Egypt, because the papyri reeds grew on the shore of Egypt. So they would take them, they would wet them, weave them together, and then smooth them out with a pumice stone and let them dry. That was your papyrus, and that became pretty much the writing medium of the ancient world for a long, long time. Most of the manuscripts that we have of the New Testament are on papyrus. So the Jews at Elephantine had produced a lot of papyrus, and while a lot of it isn't extremely significant to the biblical account itself, what the Jews at Elephantine do show through the papyrus is that they had kind of their own little self-standing Jewish system. They had a temple, they had priests, they had a high priest, and it never seemed to really bother them that they weren't where? That they weren't in Jerusalem. So what are you starting to see in the attitude of the Jews at this point in time? What are you starting to see in the attitude of the Jews at this point in time? They're starting to kind of relax this idea that everything revolves around Jerusalem. That everything revolves around Jerusalem. I've got in your notes that some of the papyri were it was talking about how the Egyptian priests at Elephantine destroyed the Jews' temple. So in the papyri, they were asking for permission to rebuild it. They were given permission. They wrote to the high priest and to his companions of the priest who were in Jerusalem, and to Ostan, the brother of Anan, and the nobles of the Jews, to Delaiah and to Shemaiah, the sons of Sanballat, the governor of Samaria. And it just shows that they not only had their own self-sufficient structure and whole idea around their Judaism, but also they would reach out to those in Jerusalem, and that also, it brings up just a real quick point, Sanballat, who we learned about in what book? In Nehemiah, was actually we would go through the book of Nehemiah, and you would have a tendency to just kind of call him a bit player, but he actually wasn't in world history. In that time period, he was rather important. But the temple was allowed to be rebuilt. They were able to go and do their own offerings. And it just goes to show that Judaism in between the Testaments not only was in existence, but it was starting to crop up and be in existence in other places than Jerusalem, which is a great segue to bring us up to the synagogues. Because this is really, really going to be where Judaism is going to continue to thrive. And continue to thrive, you could almost kind of say, into this present time. So what is a synagogue? What is a synagogue? Okay, so it is a center of Jewish life. The word synagogue, interestingly, as we'll see, or we get into this next time, the word synagogue is what kind of word? It's a Greek word. So now we're at the point where the Greek influence in the world is going to really start ramping up, and that's what we'll talk about next week. The word synagogue is a word that means a gathering or a congregation of people. A gathering or a congregation of people. I don't think we've ever studied the book of Ezekiel together. I don't ever remember it. But a lot of people believe that the nascent idea of the synagogues come from Ezekiel. Because in Ezekiel, in three places, in Ezekiel 8, in chapter 14, and in chapter 20, you have Ezekiel going and talking to who? In 8, in 14, and 20. Who does Ezekiel go and talk to? And remember, where is Ezekiel? Where is Ezekiel? I know we haven't studied it, so you'll have to take your... If you know it, that's wonderful. If you take your best guess, that's great too. Ezekiel was in captivity. So when he writes to these people in Ezekiel 8, in chapter 14, and chapter 20, he's writing to people and reflecting with people not only there, but also in Jerusalem. But in 8, in 14, and in 20, he's speaking to the people there. And what were they doing? What does he write? Who does he write to? Who does he mention in those places? The elders of the people. So from that, a lot of people have believed that in captivity, the elders of the people would establish synagogues, because they couldn't do what? They couldn't go to Jerusalem, and they didn't do what? The Jews at Elephantine could build their own temple and have their own priest and all of that, but in captivity, they either didn't want to do it or they simply couldn't do it. So what was the solution? It was going to become the synagogue. Now again, it's a Greek word. If this is truly what's taking place in the book of Ezekiel, it's in its very, very first formation of it, and wouldn't have been called a synagogue while they were in Persian captivity. But it was going to be ultimately that idea. So what do you know about a synagogue? They read Scripture, because we know that from Luke chapter 4. It had it could be established wherever there were the heads of 10 families. It had an ark, so to speak, where they would hold their holy rolls. It had a chief seat, because the scribes and the Pharisees wanted the what? Chief seats. Those were chief seats in the synagogue. It had a door that pointed toward, supposedly, pointed toward Jerusalem. So some of these pictures, some of these ruins were of synagogues, and this is probably the best known ruin of a synagogue. I wish I could remember exactly where this is, but the important point to remember is that this was well after the time of Jesus. So this would have been 3 or 4th century AD, 300 or 400 years after the time of Jesus. This was somewhere it was either in Corinth or Ephesus or something, but you can see that this one is relatively well preserved. And when they take all of the pieces that were there, all of the ruins that were there, and they try to reconstruct what would have existed, it would have looked something like this. So it's a pretty nice little building, but one thing that you can immediately see, it didn't look anything like a what? A temple. Or even, if you go even further back in history, didn't look anything like a what? Like a tabernacle. So nothing like a temple or a tabernacle. But when you look into, this is an older picture, but probably more like 1800s. You look inside of a synagogue, and it's a fairly Spartan, it's a pretty simple structure. Do we still have synagogues today? Yes, all kinds of them. I can't remember if we have a synagogue here in Lufkin or not. Does anyone know? Okay, I know that we have groups of Jews in Lufkin. I'm positive about that, but I don't know if we have an actual proper synagogue anywhere. I'll try to look. I should have remembered to try to look that up, but I didn't. So the synagogue, Luke chapter 4, we see what they did, the scripture reading and things like that. So let's just finish up this section with the emergence of Judaism and just mention what was going to happen as we look forward to the Greek period. So the emergence of Judaism, the scriptures filled the vacuum of the temple being destroyed. So yes, there was a destruction of the temple, but there was something that came in and filled that void, and mainly that was the copy of the scriptures. The synagogue and its services kind of became the Jews' community center. And if you see synagogues today, you will see that. In fact, I think I've seen some synagogues that mention that it is a synagogue of such and such, and then it'll also say and community center. Also, Aramaic, the language of diplomacy in the Persian Empire, became the Jews' vernacular, and that was really important at that point in time. We look back at the ancient writings that we have from this period, and a lot of them are done in Aramaic. In fact, there were a lot of sections I won't say a lot, there were some sections in the Old Testament that were written in what? In Aramaic. So there was this transition from Hebrew to Aramaic to, very soon, to what? To Greek, which we'll talk about possibly next week. And then just lastly, Judaism became a missionary religion, teaching Gentiles to turn their backs on paganism. So if you were a pagan and you began to convert over to Judaism, what were you called? You were called a proselyte. So the idea of proselytes in the New Testament comes from this intertestamental period where the Jews become a missionary religion. It wasn't as much back in the Old Testament. They were more of a self-contained unit, which ironically God had even kind of criticized them for a little bit in the book of Isaiah. They were to be His servant, to show His praises out to the rest of the world. Well, that really ramps up when you get into this intertestamental period. So next time I'll have more material for you, and we'll look at the Greek period.